Join us on Patreon and become part of our journey to uncover history's untold stories. Your support helps us create in-depth content, bring hidden narratives to life, and keep history alive for everyone.
The history of European colonization in the Americas is one of profound transformation, disruption, and violence. It has long been shaped by narratives that selectively emphasize certain aspects while conveniently omitting others. Among the many stories marginalized or distorted is the erasure of dark-skinned Native Americans from the historical record. This phenomenon was not only a consequence of the physical violence and displacement brought by European settlers, but also a deliberate act of cultural annihilation and racial reclassification. The erasure of these groups speaks volumes about how colonialism worked to create and enforce racial hierarchies, suppress indigenous identities, and rewrite history to fit a Eurocentric worldview. When Europeans first arrived in the Americas, they encountered a vast diversity of indigenous peoples with a wide range of skin tones, cultural practices, and social structures. These communities had lived on the land for millennia, cultivating relationships with their environments and developing complex societies. Yet, the European colonists brought with them preconceived notions of race, derived largely from their experiences in Africa and the Mediterranean. For them, darker skin was associated with subjugation and servitude, a belief that had been reinforced by the burgeoning transatlantic slave trade. As a result, the existence of dark-skinned Native Americans challenged these simplistic racial categorizations and complicated the colonial project of domination. One of the earliest and most insidious ways in which dark-skinned Native Americans were erased was through the process of racial reclassification. Colonial authorities and settlers frequently categorized indigenous peoples according to European racial taxonomies, which were designed to justify slavery and dispossession. Those Native Americans who had darker skin were often classified as Negroes or mulattoes, erasing their distinct cultural identities. This practice was particularly prevalent in regions like the southeastern United States, where indigenous peoples such as the Yamasee, Guayel, and Timucua were often reclassified as African or mixed race. These reclassifications allowed European settlers to justify enslaving dark-skinned Native Americans by conflating them with African-descended peoples who were already subject to enslavement. The forced assimilation policies imposed by European colonists further contributed to the erasure of dark-skinned Native Americans. Missionary efforts, particularly by Catholic orders such as the Jesuits and Franciscans, sought to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity and integrate them into European-style settlements. These missions often targeted children, removing them from their families and communities to indoctrinate them in colonial schools. Dark-skinned Native Americans, who were already marginalized by their appearance, were often singled out for the harshest treatment. Over time, these assimilation efforts led to the loss of indigenous languages, traditions, and social structures, further erasing the distinct identities of these communities. Another key aspect of this erasure was the role of visual representation. European colonists and artists often depicted Native Americans in ways that conformed to their own racial ideologies. In these representations, indigenous peoples were typically shown with lighter skin, aligning them more closely with European standards of beauty and civilization. Dark-skinned Native Americans, by contrast, were often excluded from such depictions or portrayed in ways that dehumanized them. This selective representation not only reinforced colonial racial hierarchies, but also contributed to the broader cultural amnesia surrounding dark-skinned indigenous peoples. The process of erasure was also facilitated by the destruction of indigenous records and cultural artifacts. European colonists often viewed indigenous knowledge systems as primitive or heretical, leading to the widespread destruction of Native American texts, artworks, and sacred sites. For dark-skinned Native Americans, this destruction was particularly devastating, as it erased much of the evidence of their existence and contributions to indigenous cultures. This loss of cultural heritage has made it difficult for modern historians and archaeologists to reconstruct the histories of these communities, further perpetuating their marginalization. The introduction of African slaves into the Americas added another layer of complexity to the erasure of dark-skinned Native Americans. As the transatlantic slave trade grew, European colonists began to rely increasingly on African labor to support their plantations and economies. In many cases, dark-skinned Native Americans were enslaved alongside Africans, leading to the formation of mixed communities. Over time, The descendants of these communities were often classified as Black or African American, obscuring their indigenous heritage. This process was particularly pronounced in areas such as the Caribbean and Brazil, where the lines between African and indigenous identities became increasingly blurred. One of the most striking examples of this erasure can be seen in the story of the Black Seminoles. This group emerged in the southeastern United States during the 18th century as escaped African slaves sought refuge among the Seminole people. Over time, the Black Seminoles developed a distinct cultural identity that blended African and Native American traditions. However, colonial authorities often refused to recognize this hybridity, instead categorizing the Black Seminoles as African. This misclassification not only erased their indigenous heritage, but also made them targets for re-enslavement under the guise of recapturing runaway slaves. The erasure of dark-skinned Native Americans was not limited to the colonial period. It has persisted into the modern era. In the United States, for example, the implementation of blood quantum laws in the 19th and 20th centuries further marginalized dark-skinned Native Americans. These laws, which defined tribal membership based on the percentage of Indian blood, were designed to limit the number of people who could claim indigenous identity. Dark-skinned Native Americans, who were often perceived as having mixed African ancestry, were frequently excluded from tribal roles, effectively severing their ties to their communities. The legacy of this erasure can still be seen today in the ways that dark-skinned Native Americans are marginalized within broader narratives of indigenous history and identity. In popular culture, dark-skinned indigenous peoples are often overlooked or misrepresented, perpetuating stereotypes that associate indigeneity with lighter skin tones. This has profound implications for how indigenous peoples are perceived and treated, both within their own communities and by society at large. Efforts to reclaim and celebrate the histories of dark-skinned Native Americans have gained momentum in recent years, thanks in part to the work of indigenous scholars, activists, and artists. These efforts have sought to challenge the dominant narratives of colonial history and highlight the resilience and contributions of dark-skinned indigenous peoples. By recovering and preserving their stories, these movements are helping to combat the erasure that has long plagued these communities. The erasure of dark-skinned Native Americans during European colonization is a testament to the power of colonialism to shape and distort history. It reflects the ways in which racial ideologies were used to justify the exploitation and marginalization of indigenous peoples, while also highlighting the resilience of those who resisted these efforts. As we continue to grapple with the legacies of colonialism, it is essential to recognize and honor the diversity of indigenous experiences, including those of dark-skinned Native Americans. Only by doing so can we begin to address the injustices of the past and build a more inclusive understanding of history.